There is a dangerous arrogance that comes with a multi-thousand-dollar rifle and a digital ballistics calculator. It whispers a lie into the ear of the modern marksman. That technology has conquered nature. This is the story of Corporal Declan Knox, a young prodigy fresh from the military's most elite sniper program, who stood in the swirling, chaotic winds of a Texas canyon and declared a 1,200-yard shot mathematically impossible. He packed up his state-of-the-art gear, defeated by the elements. But he wasn't alone on the firing line. Watching from the shadows was Arthur Callahan, a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran holding a battered wooden stock. Husonut Kaliber Pellet gun. What happened next didn't just defy the laws of physics, it shattered the young sniper's entire reality. The Blackbrush firing range sat like a dusty scar on the edge of the West Texas Badlands. It was a place where the sun didn't just shine. It hammered the earth like an anvil. Heat waves distorted the horizon, turning the distant limestone bluffs into shimmering liquid mirages. For most shooters, this was a nightmare environment. For Corporal Declan Knox, it was a stage. Declan was 24, lean, and possessed the kind of unearned swagger that only came from being the top graduate of the United States Army Sniper School at Fort Moore. Beside him, hunched over a spotting scope on a shooting mat, was his spotter and childhood friend, Sergeant Brody Miller. Laid out before them, resting on a set of carbon fiber bipods, was Declan's pride and joy, a custom-built 338 Lapua Magnum. It was a masterpiece of modern lethality. It featured a chiseled aluminum chassis, a suppressor the size of a baseball bat, and an optic that cost more than a reliable used car. Bolted to the side was a digital weather meter feeding real-time density altitude, barometric pressure, and temperature readings directly into a ballistic application on Brody's iPad. Target identified, 800 yards. Blue steel silhouette, Brody announced, his eye pressed to the spotting glass. Wind is full value from 3 o'clock, steady at 8 miles per hour, dial left 0.6 mils. Declan didn't even blink. He adjusted the turret on his scope with a crisp, audible click. He settled his cheek against the adjustable rest, controlling his breathing until his heart rate slowed to a rhythmic, heavy thump. He found the pause between beats. Crack. The massive rifle bucked against his shoulder. A microsecond later, a puff of dust erupted on the distant hillside, followed immediately by the satisfying metallic clang echoing back across the scrubland. Center mass. Brody grinned, marking a digital clipboard. You're making this look boring. December. It is boring. Declan scoffed, racking the bolt and sending a smoking, 3-inch brass casing flying onto the dirt. The math does all the work. If you have the data, the bullet just follows the wire. Give me something harder. 50 yards away, sitting on an overturned plastic bucket beneath the shade of a corrugated tin roof, Arthur Callahan watched in silence. Arthur Arty, to the locals who bothered to speak to him, was the range safety officer, janitor, and unofficial ghost of Blackbrush. He was a relic, a 72-year-old man carved out of old leather and quiet regrets. He wore a faded, sweat-stained olive drab cap that bore no insignia, though the slight, permanent limp in his right leg and the faded tattoo on his forearm whispered of the jungles of Southeast Asia, circa 1969. Arty wasn't impressed by the 338 Lapua. He wasn't impressed by the iPad or the carbon fiber bipods. He had spent the morning sweeping up brass casings and emptying overflowing trash cans, listening to the young corporal boast about sub-MOA groupings and ballistic coefficients. Arty took a slow sip from a thermos of lukewarm black coffee. He watched the wind chimes hanging from the rain shack. They hadn't made a sound all morning, but Arty knew this canyon. He knew the barometric pressure was dropping, not because an app told him, but because the arthritis in his reconstructed knee was beginning to throb with a dull, familiar ache. The Badlands were about to wake up. "Hey, old man," Declan called out, his voice dripping with casual condescension. "You ever see a rig like this back in your day? Or were you guys still throwing rocks?" Brody chuckled nervously, elbowing his friend. "Take it easy, man." Arty didn't react immediately. He slowly screwed the cup back onto his thermos, stood up, and grabbed his push broom. He limped forward, his eyes fixed not on the expensive rifle, but on the shifting dust devils beginning to form in the valley below. "I've seen plenty of fine rifles, son," Artie's voice was like gravel under a tire, quiet but impossible to ignore. But a rifle is just a tool. It doesn't know how to read the earth. It only knows what you tell it. Declan smirked, leaning back on his elbows. I tell it exactly what it needs to know. Wind, drop, spin drift, Coriolis effect. It's a perfect science. Science is clean, Artie said, leaning on his broom. The Badlands are dirty. Let's see how your science holds up when the canyon clears its throat. As if on cue, the tin roof of the firing line groaned. The stagnant, suffocating air suddenly shattered as a violent gust of wind ripped across the firing line, blowing Declan's ballistic charts off the mat and sending a cloud of blinding red dust into the air. The Texas Diablo had arrived. Within 10 minutes, the environment at Blackbrush had transformed from a static, heated vacuum into a chaotic wind tunnel. The Diablo wind wasn't a steady breeze. It was a living, breathing entity. It surged to 20 miles per hour, dropped to dead calm for 3 seconds, and then snapped back from the opposite direction. Kestrel is going crazy, Brody shouted over the howl of the wind, holding up the digital weather meter. The tiny impeller blades were a blur. It's reading 12 miles an hour at the line, but looking at the mirage and the brush downrange, it's swirling. I'm seeing updrafts at 400 yards and a heavy crosswind at 800. Declan's jaw tightened. This was the challenge he had been begging for, but the reality was intensely frustrating. He scanned the distant limestone bluff through his optic. There, Declan pointed. The Widowmaker, high up on a jagged, protruding finger of rock on the opposite side of the canyon, nearly 1,200 yards away, sat a rusted, 10-inch steel plate. It was a legendary target at Blackbrush, placed there decades ago, and rarely rung. To hit it, a bullet had to traverse a plunging valley, survive a massive thermal updraft rising from the sun-baked canyon floor, and punch through the erratic crosswinds swirling around the limestone pillars. You're kidding, Brody said, squinting through the spotting scope. Deck, the wind is bouncing off the canyon walls. It's a blender out there. The software can't calculate a firing solution for 3 different, opposing wind zones. Just give me an average, Declan snapped, his ego flaring. He wasn't about to back down in front of his spotter. Or worse, the old janitor who was still quietly sweeping behind them. Okay, Brody said, his fingers flying across the iPad screen. Average wind value, call it 15 miles per hour from the left. But Deck, the updraft in the center of the canyon is going to lift the round. Dial down 2 clicks. Hold left 2.5 mils. Send it when you feel a lull. Declan settled in. He stared through the glass, watching the heat mirage boil violently across the canyon. He waited for the wind against his cheek to die down. The second the pressure eased, he squeezed the trigger. Crack. Brody watched intently. Miss. High. And right. The updraft caught it and pushed it into the crosswind. You missed by a full 3 feet. Declan cursed under his breath. He aggressively racked the bolt, adjusting, holding lower, pushing further left. He fired again. Miss. Brody called out. Low. The wind died in the canyon the second you pulled the trigger. You overcompensated. For 20 minutes, the canyon echoed with the booming reports of the 338 Lapua. 7 shots, 7 misses. Each time, the erratic, surging winds grabbed the massive 250 grain bullet and threw it wildly off course. Declan's frustration boiled over into anger. The precision, the mathematics, the absolute certainty he had relied upon were useless in this chaotic environment. The wind was playing a cruel game, shifting its speed and direction faster than the bullet could travel the distance. Sweat poured down Declan's face, stinging his eyes. He violently shoved the bolt forward, loading his 8th round, his breathing heavy and ragged. He fired without waiting for Brody's call. A puff of dust erupted on the cliff face, 5 feet to the left of the steel plate. Damn it, Declan roared, slamming his fist into the shooting mat. He ejected the live magazine and unceremoniously stood up, dusting off his tactical pants. Brody looked up, surprised. We still have ammo. December. We can figure this out. There's nothing to figure out, Declan snapped, gesturing wildly at the canyon. Look at the brush. It's blowing left, right, and straight up all at the same time. The atmospheric conditions are currently incompatible with a ballistic trajectory to that specific coordinate. The bullet is moving too fast. It's punching through microclimates before it can stabilize. He grabbed his expensive rifle by the chassis and began stuffing it into its protective hard case. "Just leave that target," Declan said, his voice loud enough to ensure the old man heard him. "It's impossible today. It's mathematically, physically impossible. Nobody on Earth is making that shot until this thermal system breaks. End of story." "Is that a fact?" The voice was quiet, but it cut through the howling wind like a razor blade. Declan froze, turning slowly. Artie was standing 10 feet away. He had put the push broom down. He wasn't smiling, but there was a deep, ancient amusement dancing in his pale blue eyes. "You got something to say, old man?" Declan challenged, taking a step forward. "You want to tell me how back in your day you would have calculated the wind with a wet finger and hit it with a musket?" Artie shook his head slowly. "I'm just saying, young man, that your bullet is too heavy and it's flying too fast. It's trying to fight the canyon. You can't fight a canyon. You have to ride it." Declan let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Ride it? What is this? A mystical martial arts movie? It's exterior ballistics. Pop. It's math. Math says a bumblebee shouldn't be able to fly," Artie replied evenly. "But the bee doesn't know math, so it flies anyway." Declan zipped up his rifle case with a loud, aggressive pull. "Right. Well, I'm dealing with reality. And in reality, that shot is impossible." Artie looked out at the distant, rusted plate. Impossible is a strong word for a boy who hasn't learned to look at the sky. Without another word, Artie turned his back on the young sniper and began limping toward the gravel parking lot behind the firing line. Declan and Brody exchanged incredulous glances as they watched the old man walk away. "Is he serious?" Declan muttered, shaking his head. "Guy probably hasn't shot a rifle since the Nixon administration." They expected Artie to get into his rusted 1988 Ford F-150 and drive away. Instead, Artie opened the passenger door, reached behind the bench seat, and pulled out a long, slender object wrapped in an old, oil-stained moving blanket. He closed the truck door and began the slow limp back to the firing line. As Artie unwrapped the bundle, Declan had to bite his lip to keep from laughing out loud. It wasn't a sniper rifle. It wasn't even a hunting rifle. It was a heavily scarred, vintage pre-charged pneumatic PCP air rifle. It had a beautifully worn walnut stock that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck, an oversized air cylinder under the barrel, and a massive, heavy-duty cocking lever. There was no scope on it, only a set of rusted, heavy-post iron sights. "You have got to be kidding me," Declan said, crossing his arms. "What is that? A souped-up Red Ryder? You're going to shoot an air gun at a 1,200-yard target?" Artie didn't answer right away. He walked past Declan and stepped onto the concrete firing line. He set a small tin of what looked like oversized, custom-cast lead pellets onto a wooden bench. "This is an old Air Force Texan, highly modified. Shoots a .25 caliber lead slug," Artie said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected reverence. "Most folks use them to take down hogs at 50 yards. Pop, that target is over 3/4 of a mile away," Brody interjected, trying to be respectful but clearly concerned for the old man's sanity. "A pellet from that gun won't even reach the canyon floor. It'll drop like a stone. If I shoot it straight." "Yes," Artie agreed. He picked up a single lead slug. It was heavy, shaped like a miniature artillery shell rather than a standard pellet. He manually seated it into the breech and closed the heavy steel bolt with a resounding clack. Artie looked at Declan. "Your bullet leaves the muzzle at 3,000 feet per second. It hits the crosswinds and fights them, but it's going too fast to get pushed into the thermal. It just gets battered." Artie pointed a weathered, calloused finger toward the canyon. "Look down there. See where the mesquite bushes are shaking violently on the canyon floor. But the dust is spiraling straight up against the cliff face?" Declan frowned, following the old man's finger. He saw it, a massive, localized thermal updraft created by the sun superheating the canyon floor, was rushing vertically up the side of the limestone bluff, exactly where the target sat. "The wind is blowing left to right at 20 miles an hour here," Artie continued, his eyes scanning the invisible currents of the air. "But right at the edge of that drop-off, the thermal catches the crosswind, and funnels it into a vortex that shoots straight up the cliff. Artie brought the heavy, cumbersome air rifle up to his shoulder. He didn't lie down on a mat. He didn't deploy bipods. He stood upright, adopting a classic, offhand shooting stance that belonged in a 19th century dueling manual. "A heavy bullet punches right through that thermal," Artie whispered, his cheek resting against the scarred walnut stock. "But a slow, heavy lead slug. If you drop it into the vortex at the exact right angle, the canyon will carry it the rest of the way." Declan was about to protest the sheer lunacy of the physics, but something in Artie's stance stopped him. The old man's tremor was gone. He stood like a statue carved from the limestone itself. Artie didn't aim at the target. To the utter shock of the two young soldiers, Artie aimed the barrel of the air rifle at an absurd 45-degree angle into the sky, pointing a solid 100 yards to the left of the cliff. He looked like he was trying to shoot down a low-flying cloud. "He's mortaring it," Brody whispered, his eyes wide. "He's trying to drop it in from orbit." "It's impossible," Declan hissed back. "Even with an updraft, the terminal velocity of a pellet, he can't calculate the wind drift without a computer." Artie closed his left eye. He didn't have a kestrel. He had the ache in his knee, the sound of the wind tearing through the tin roof, and 50 years of memory. He remembered watching mortar flares drop through the jungle canopy. He remembered the invisible rivers of air. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. The wind howled, blowing red dust against their legs. Suddenly, the wind at the firing line dropped to a dead calm. A vacuum. Artie exhaled a long, slow breath and squeezed the trigger. Thwomp. The sound was shockingly quiet compared to the deafening roar of the Lapua. It was a hollow, compressed burst of air. Declan immediately threw his eye behind his massive rifle scope, trying to track the impossible shot. Brody was glued to the spotting scope. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. "Flight time is too long," Declan muttered, his heart hammering against his ribs despite himself. "It's in the dirt." 4 seconds, 5 seconds. High above the canyon, the slow-moving lead slug had reached the apex of its massive parabolic arc. It began to fall, accelerating toward the earth, drifting wildly to the right under the force of the crosswind. It was falling short, destined to crash into the canyon floor. But then, it hit the invisible wall of the thermal. The superheated air rushing up the cliff face caught the lightweight projectile. It didn't stop the slug from falling, but it drastically slowed its descent, acting like an invisible hand, surfing the pellet up the jagged face of the limestone bluff. 6 seconds. The silence on the firing line was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, faint but unmistakably clear, carried back across the canyon on the swirling breeze, came a sound. Dink. It wasn't the heavy, ringing gong of a high-velocity sniper round. It was a delicate, fragile ping. The sound of a lead pellet kissing a rusted steel plate. Brody gasped, pulling his face away from the spotting scope. He looked at Artie, his face pale, completely devoid of color. Declan froze. His eye remained pressed to his optic, staring at the tiny gray smudge of fresh lead that had just blossomed on the upper right corner of the Widowmaker target. 1,200 yards away. His brain short-circuited. Every manual he had ever read, every hour of classroom instruction, every digital algorithm he had mastered, screamed that what had just happened was a physical impossibility. Slowly, Declan lifted his head from the rifle. He looked at the old man in the faded USMC cap. Artie calmly lowered the air rifle. He cracked the breech open, releasing a small hiss of residual air. He didn't smile. He didn't boast. He just looked at the young, stunned corporal, with a gaze that held the weight of 1,000 untold stories. "Physics, son," Artie said quietly, turning to walk back to his push broom, "is just a suggestion." The drive back to the Fort Moore barracks was suffocatingly quiet. Brody drove his battered Tacoma, his eyes flicking nervously to the passenger seat. Declan sat rigid, staring straight ahead through the dusty windshield. His knuckles were white, gripping the edge of the Kestrel wind meter, as if trying to crush the hard plastic casing. "You want to talk about it?" Brody finally asked, breaking a 40-minute silence as the base gates came into view. "Talk about what?" Declan snapped, his voice tight. "A 1 in a million statistical anomaly? A localized pressure drop that coincidentally aligned with the parabolic trajectory of a subsonic lead slug. There's nothing to talk about, Brody. It was a freak accident of fluid dynamics. Brody sighed, tapping the steering wheel. Deck. I watched the old man's face. He didn't look surprised. He looked like he was doing a math problem in his head, only he wasn't using numbers. Nobody does that, Declan exploded, slamming his fist onto the dashboard. You don't just feel a 1,200 yards shot through 3 opposing wind columns. I don't care if you're Chris Kyle or Carlos Hathcock. The math is the math. Without the data, you are just guessing. He guessed, and the canyon handed him a miracle. But when Declan returned to his quarters, he didn't sleep. He sat at his small metal desk in the dark, the glowing screen of his laptop casting harsh shadows across his face. He opened his advanced ballistics software, a military-grade program designed to calculate trajectories for artillery and long-range sniper platforms. He inputted the variables. Target distance, 1,200 yards. Projectile, 25 caliber lead slug, 70, 2 grains. Muzzle velocity, 900 feet per second. He added the crosswinds, the barometric pressure, the estimated speed of the thermal updraft. He hit calculate. The screen blinked, generating a jagged, chaotic flight path that terminated abruptly in the simulated dirt, hundreds of yards short and miles off target. The software flashed a red error message. Lack of projectile stabilization. Terminal flight path unpredictable. Declan ran the simulation 50 different times, altering the wind speeds by fractions of a mile per hour, tweaking the angle of departure. Every single time, the computer told him the shot was physically impossible. Yet, the distinct tink of lead hitting steel still echoed in his ears. At 0300 hours, Brody's door down the hall creaked open. Declan knocked twice and let himself in. Brody was sitting up in bed, an illuminated tablet in his hands, surrounded by energy drink cans. I couldn't sleep either, Brody muttered, rubbing his eyes. I got on the SIPRnet, the secure network. I wanted to see who exactly sweeps the brass out at Blackbrush. Declan pulled up a chair, his skepticism fighting a losing battle against his burning curiosity. And? Did he peel potatoes in Da Nang? Not quite, Brody said, his tone dead serious. He turned the tablet around. The file was heavily redacted, thick black bars obscuring entire paragraphs. But what remained was chilling. Callahan, Arthur J., USMC. He wasn't a sniper, Deck, Brody said quietly. He was attached to MAC V SOG, the Studies and Observations Group. Specifically, a highly classified element operating out of Firebase Ripcord. But look at his MOS, his occupational specialty. Declan squinted at the screen. 0317 is Scout Sniper, but it's crossed out. What's the secondary designation? It says, Acoustic Intelligence and Subterranean Operations, Brody translated. December. The old man was a tunnel rat, but not just a guy clearing bunkers. He was part of a designated hunter-killer team that went deep into the Ho Chi Minh trail cave networks. The file says he operated for weeks underground, and in the deep jungle canopy, Brody paused, swallowing hard. Using suppressed air rifles and subsonic rimfire to eliminate sentries without alerting the entire North Vietnamese army. Declan stared at the glowing screen. The arrogance began to drain out of him, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. He wasn't fighting the wind today, Brody whispered. He was fighting the wind in the dark, 50 years ago. He knows things about air pressure our computers haven't even figured out yet. Declan stood up, his jaw set. Get your gear, Brody. We're going back to Blackbrush. First light. The morning sun was just beginning to bake the limestone when Declan's truck pulled into the Blackbrush parking lot. The range was closed to civilians on Tuesdays, making the sprawling complex eerily quiet. Artie was already there. He was sitting on the tailgate of his rusted Ford, a disassembled bolt-action rifle resting on an oily rag across his lap. He was painstakingly polishing a firing pin with a piece of steel wool. He didn't look up as the two young soldiers approached. Range is closed, boys, Artie rasped. Declan stopped 3 feet away. He didn't have his expensive Kestrel. He didn't have his iPad. He just had a burning, desperate need to understand. I ran the numbers, Declan said, his voice stripped of the swagger from the day before. I ran them 50 times through the DoD's best software. It says what you did cannot happen. Artie blew a speck of dust off the firing pin, held it up to the morning light, and nodded approvingly. Computers are very good at telling you what normally happens, Corporal Knox. They are exceptionally bad at telling you what can happen. How did you do it? Declan asked, taking a step closer. Brody looked you up. MAC-V, SOG, tunnel rat. But that doesn't explain how you dropped a slug through a vortex at 3/4 of a mile. Artie finally looked up. His blue eyes locked onto Declan, and for the first time, the young sniper saw the lethal intensity buried beneath the old man's weary exterior. You boys rely on algorithms, Artie said, wiping his hands on a rag. You look through your glass, and you see a two-dimensional grid. You see numbers, wind speed, distance, drop. You try to force a piece of metal through the air using raw velocity and mathematical force. Artie stood up, leaning slightly on the truck bed. In the Ashau Valley, in '69, I didn't have an iPad. I had a Sheridan pneumatic air rifle firing a .20 caliber dart. If I missed, the NVA camp would hear the snap of the brush, and I'd be dead in 2 minutes. I was hunting a man they called the Whisper. He was a local counter-sniper who hid in the triple canopy jungle. He didn't use a scope. He used the way the leaves flipped over before a storm to gauge the barometric pressure. Declan was silent, hanging on every word. Brody stood beside him, completely transfixed. I tracked him for 3 days, Artie continued, his voice dropping to a hypnotic cadence. I finally found him across a ravine, 400 yards, with an air rifle that might as well be the moon. The wind in the jungle canopy doesn't blow, son. It breathes, it circulates, it spirals. If I aimed straight at him, the dart would have been swallowed by the updrafts. Artie reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out a battered leather-bound notebook. He tossed it to Declan. Declan caught it and opened it. Inside were not numbers or ballistic charts, but incredibly detailed, hand-drawn sketches of wind currents, thermal columns, and topographical layouts. I didn't calculate the shot, Artie said. I watched a single dead leaf fall from a mahogany tree near his position. I watched how long it took to hit the ground, how it spun, how the invisible rivers of air pulled it. I didn't aim at him. I aimed at the river. Artie stepped closer, pointing a finger at Declan's chest. You shoot through the air. You treat it like an enemy you have to defeat with speed and ballistic coefficient. You have to stop fighting it. You have to let the air carry the round. Declan looked down at the notebook, his mind racing. It was a paradigm shift that completely contradicted everything Fort Moore had drilled into his brain. That's instinct. It's not repeatable. In modern combat, we need repeatability. Do you? Artie challenged, a faint smile touching his lips. If your battery dies, or your software glitches, or a Texas Diablo wind turns your algorithm to garbage, what good is your repeatability then? You become a machine with a broken wire. I am the machine. Declan looked out at the canyon. The morning air was still relatively calm, but the heat mirage was already beginning to shimmer above the dirt. Teach me, Declan said. It wasn't a demand this time. It was a request. Artie chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. You can't teach a man to feel the wind if his head is full of numbers. You have to empty the cup first. How? Artie turned and pointed toward the far end of the Blackbrush property, an area marked with faded yellow danger, do not enter signs. It was a jagged, labyrinthine offshoot of the main canyon known locally as the Devil's Throat. It was a natural wind tunnel full of erratic thermals, jagged rocks, and unpredictable downdrafts. There's a storm front moving in from the panhandle, Artie said, looking at the western horizon, which was beginning to bruise with dark purple clouds. Barometric pressure is plummeting. In 3 hours, this place is going to be a washing machine. Artie reached into his truck cab and pulled out a rifle. But it wasn't the air gun. It was an old, beat-up Remington 700 with a heavy wooden stock and a scratched, fixed 1-0 power scope. It was a classic Marine Corps M40 clone. No ballistic calculator, no wind meter mount, no laser rangefinder. He held it out to Declan. You leave the iPad here, Artie said, his eyes narrowing. You leave the Kestrel. You take this. We walk out to the Devil's Throat. I'm going to hang a 10-inch steel plate on a rope across the ravine. The wind is going to push it, swing it, and lift it. If you can hit it on the first shot, using nothing but your eyes, your skin, and your gut, I'll tell you the rest of the A Shao story. I'll show you exactly how to map a thermal. Declan looked at the old, analog rifle. It felt like stepping back in time. He looked at Brody, who gave a slow, uncertain nod. "And if I miss?" Declan asked. "If you miss," Artie said, his voice hardening, "you admit that your technology is a crutch, and you spend the next month down here, off-duty, sweeping brass and listening to the canyon instead of your computer." Declan took a deep breath. He reached out and wrapped his hand around the scarred wooden stock of the M40. The wood felt warm, alive in a way his carbon fiber chassis never did. "Deal," Declan said. By noon, the sky over Blackbrush had turned the color of an old bruise. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a matter of minutes, and the air took on the metallic, heavy scent of impending rain and churned up alkali dust. A haboob, a massive West Texas dust storm, was riding the leading edge of the front. Declan, Brody, and Artie stood on a jagged precipice overlooking the Devil's Throat. The terrain here was a nightmare. The ravine was only 600 yards across, but it was incredibly deep, acting as a massive funnel for the shifting atmospheric pressures. On the opposite side, Artie had hiked down earlier and rigged a heavy steel plate to a thick nylon rope, suspending it from a twisted, dead cedar tree that jutted out over the abyss. The wind began to howl. It wasn't a steady blow. It was violent and schizophrenic. It roared down the canyon, caught the steel plate, and sent it swinging wildly in chaotic arcs. It would sway left, get caught by an updraft, bounce upward, and then spin as a crosswind slammed into it. Brody instinctively reached for his pocket where he usually kept the Kestrel, but his hand found empty fabric. He looked naked without his technology. "Target is erratic," Brody shouted over the wind, shielding his eyes from the stinging dust. "Range is roughly 600, but deck, the plate is swinging in a 3-foot arc, and it's moving on the Z-axis too. The wind is blowing directly in our faces, but I can see dust devils down in the ravine moving sideways." Declan lay prone on the rocky outcropping. The old M40 pulled tight into his shoulder. Looking through the fixed 10x scope was jarring. There were no illuminated reticles, no digital readouts, no cant indicators. Just plain, black crosshairs against a swirling, dusty background. He tracked the swinging plate. His brain instinctively tried to calculate lead times based on standard formulas, but the plate wasn't moving like a vehicle. It was moving like a pendulum caught in a hurricane. "I can't time the swing," Declan yelled, his frustration mounting. "The wind keeps changing its momentum." Artie crouched beside him, unaffected by the dust stinging his face. He wasn't looking at the target. He was looking at the scrub brush, the dust clouds, the way the nylon rope vibrated before the wind hit it. "Stop trying to calculate the steel," Artie ordered, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. "The steel is a liar. It's just reacting. Look at the master." "The master," Declan grunted, trying to hold the crosshairs steady as a gust physically pushed his barrel. "The wind," Artie said. "Look at the canyon walls, 40 yards in front of the target. Watch the dust off the limestone." Declan shifted his field of view slightly. He forced himself to stop staring at the swinging target and look at the environment surrounding it. "There's a rhythm to the chaos," Artie coached, his hand resting lightly on Declan's shoulder. "The storm comes in waves. Pressure builds, it breaks, it swirls, and then just for a fraction of a second the pressure equalizes before the next wave hits. In that microsecond, the pendulum will reach the apex of its swing and hang in dead air. That's your window." Declan breathed in the heavy dust. He closed his left eye. He forced his mind to shut down the mathematical engine that had driven him his entire career. He stopped trying to estimate wind speed in miles per hour. He started feeling it. He felt the blast of cold air hit his cheeks. He saw the dust cloud explode off the limestone wall opposite him. He realized there was a 2-second delay between the dust exploding on the far wall and the wind hitting the swinging plate. "It's a river," he thought, remembering Artie's notebook. "Watch the current." A massive gust tore through the ravine. The steel plate violently swung up and to the right, straining the nylon rope. Declan tracked it. "Hold," Artie whispered. The dust on the far wall settled for a brief, flashing instant. The pressure dropped. Now, Declan didn't overthink it. He didn't check his crosshairs. He trusted the alignment of his eye, the wood against his cheek, and the sudden drop in the wind against his neck. He exhaled and pressed the heavy trigger of the M40. Boom! The rifle recoiled sharply. Because he had no spotter calling his trace, and the scope didn't have the clarity of his modern optics, Declan lost the target in the recoil. He quickly racked the bolt, chambering another round, desperately searching through the glass for a splash of dust on the rocks. The wind howled back to life, filling the ravine with a deafening roar. Brody was staring through a pair of basic binoculars. He didn't say a word. He slowly lowered the binos, his jaw slack. Declan squinted through the scope. The dust cleared just enough. The heavy steel plate was spinning on its rope, twisting violently not from the wind, but from the kinetic energy of a 175 grain 308 bullet that had smashed dead center into its rusted face. Declan slowly lowered the rifle. His hands were shaking, not from adrenaline, but from the profound, earth-shattering realization of what he had just done. He hadn't used a single piece of data. He had used the earth. Artie stood up, brushing the dirt off his faded jeans. He looked down at the young corporal, a genuine warm smile cracking the weathered lines of his face for the first time. "Not bad for a computer geek," Artie said softly. Declan sat up, staring at his hands, then at the old man. "You were right. The math. It's just the baseline. The real shot happens after the math stops. You found the empty space between the wind, son." Artie nodded. He looked out at the incoming storm, the dark clouds now rolling over the edge of the canyon. "Grab the rifle. Let's get back to the shed. I owe you a pot of awful coffee and a story about a man named the Whisper." As the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting the hot Texas dust with a hiss, Declan Knox slung the antique wooden rifle over his shoulder. He left his iPad and his digital meters sitting on the rocks, realizing for the first time in his life that the most powerful weapon he possessed wasn't the rifle or the software. It was the quiet, brutal understanding of the world around him. The range shack at Blackbrush was little more than corrugated tin, weathered plywood, and 50 years of accumulated dust. But as the storm hammered against the roof, it felt like a fortress. The air inside smelled of ozone, Hoppy's No. 9-gun solvent, and the bitter, dark roast coffee bubbling in a battered percolator on a small Coleman camp stove. Artie handed 2 cracked ceramic mugs to Declan and Brody. His hands, usually so steady on the rifle, trembled slightly as he poured his own cup. "You boys ever hear of Recon Team Colorado?" Artie asked, pulling his olive drab cap off and running a hand through his thinning, white hair. "Command and Control North. MACV. SOG. Declan nodded slowly, wrapping his hands around the hot mug to chase away the sudden chill. "Special Operations Group. The guys who went over the fence into Laos and Cambodia. The government denied you even existed until the late 90s. "We didn't exist," Artie said, taking a seat on an overturned crate. "And neither did the men we were hunting. The NVA had a sniper operating in the A Shau Valley. The Marines called him the Whisper. Real name was Win Van Tho. He wasn't using anything fancy. A Mosin Nagant 91 over 30 with a crude PU scope. But Tho was a ghost. He didn't just understand the jungle. He was an extension of it." Artie stared into the black liquid in his cup, his eyes glazing over as the memories pulled him half a century backward. "I was a lot like you, Corporal Knox," Artie said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper over the sound of the rain. "I was 21, cocky, and I thought the gear made the man. I had the best technology the Department of Defense could field in 1969. I had a custom Remington 700, and I had just been issued an AN PVS-2 Starlight scope. It was an early night vision optic, weighed almost 6 pounds. It was clumsy, ran on massive batteries, and ruined your natural night vision. But it was technology. I thought it made me invincible." Brody leaned forward, the swagger of the modern military suddenly feeling very small in the presence of this living history. "What happened?" "I had a spotter," Artie said, and the pain in his voice was so raw, it made Declan flinch. "Kid from Cleveland, William Hargrove. We called him Billy, best eyes in the Marine Corps. We tracked the Whisper for 5 days through triple canopy jungle. Finally, we set up an ambush across a ravine. It was twilight. The wind in the A-show at twilight is tricky. It pulls down into the valleys as the air cools. Billy told me to hold low. He was reading the leaves, feeling the temperature drop on his skin. Artie closed his eyes, but I looked through that massive starlight scope. The green phosphor screen was glowing. I couldn't see the leaves. I couldn't feel the wind because I was glued to the eyepiece, completely separated from my environment. I trusted the reticle instead of my spotter. I trusted the machine over the man. The shack was dead silent, save for the violent drumming of the rain on the tin roof. I pulled the trigger, Artie whispered. I missed though by 3 inches. The bullet hit a mahogany branch, and because I missed, I gave away our position. Though didn't need a starlight scope. He just aimed at the muzzle flash. Artie took a ragged breath, though put a 7.62 round right through Billy's neck. He bled out in my arms in 3 minutes, trying to tell me it wasn't my fault. Declan swallowed hard, looking over at Brody. The thought of losing his spotter, his best friend, because of his own arrogance. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. That's why you don't trust the tech, Declan realized aloud. I lost my rifle in the scramble to get Billy's body out, Artie continued. When I went back into the A-show 3 weeks later, I didn't take a sniper rifle. I took a Sheridan 5mm pneumatic pellet gun. Sog used them for quietly taking out sentries and guard dogs. I hunted, though, for a week. I didn't use a scope. I used my ears. I used the smell of the damp earth. When I finally found him, he was 400 yards away, hiding behind a massive root system. Artie looked up, his blue eyes piercing. I couldn't shoot through the wind. The Sheridan didn't have the velocity. So, I remembered what Billy tried to teach me. I read the updraft coming off the ravine. I aimed 60 feet above Tho's head and let the jungle carry the dart. It hit him right under the jaw. Artie set his mug down with a heavy clatter. Your kestrel meter is a fine tool, Corporal. Your iPad is a marvel of engineering. But when the battery dies, or the screen cracks, or the wind does something a microchip can't understand, you are alone. If you haven't built a relationship with the Earth will kill you. Or worse, it will kill the man sitting next to you. Declan looked at his hands. He thought about his $15,000 Lapua locked in his truck case. He thought about how blind he had been an hour ago, staring through an optic while the world moved around him unnoticed. Artie, Declan started, his voice thick with newfound respect. Quiet. Artie suddenly snapped, his entire demeanor shifting in a fraction of a second. The melancholy veteran vanished, replaced instantly by the MAC-V SOG tunnel rat. Artie held up a hand, his head tilted toward the heavy wooden door of the shack. What is it? Brody whispered. Just thunder. That wasn't thunder, Artie hissed, reaching under the table and retrieving a battered Colt M1911 pistol from a hidden shelf. He racked the slide with terrifying speed. That was a high-clearance differential grinding against a limestone rock. Someone is driving up the back trail. Brody scrambled to the single, dusty window at the front of the shack, wiping away the condensation. Outside, the haboob had turned the Texas sky into a swirling nightmare of brown dust and driving rain. Visibility was down to less than 50 yards. I see headlights, Brody reported, his voice tight. 3 vehicles, blacked-out SUVs. They're tearing through the wire fence at the far end of the Devil's Throat. Declan felt a cold spike of adrenaline. Border Patrol? Border Patrol doesn't cut wire, and they don't drive black Suburbans with no government plates, Artie said, moving to the window and peering through the crack in the blinds. This deep in West Texas, the cartels often utilize the violent dust storms to push high-value contraband or human cargo across the border. The storms grounded CBP drones and aerostats and wiped away tire tracks in minutes. They're using the range as a staging area, Artie diagnosed grimly. They probably think the place is abandoned because of the storm. As they watched, the 3 SUVs skidded to a halt in the mud, about 100 yards from the shack, right near where Declan's truck was parked. The doors flew open. Even through the blinding rain, Declan could make out the silhouettes of men piling out. They weren't ragged coyotes. They moved with tactical precision. They wore tactical vests over civilian clothes, and they were carrying rifles. Sicarios, Brody breathed, instinctively backing away from the glass. Cartel hit squad, probably Los Zetas Splinter Group or CDN. They're running a VIP or heavyweight. My rifle is in the truck. Declan gritted his teeth, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Lapua. It's locked in the Pelican case in the bed. Forget it, Artie commanded. You step out that door, you're dead before you clear the porch. They have us outgunned and outmanned. Suddenly, a massive crack echoed over the storm, and a 5.56 millimeters round punched through the tin roof of the shack, sending a shower of rust and sparks cascading onto the dirt floor. Get down, Declan yelled, tackling Brody to the floor behind the heavy wooden shooting benches. They saw the smoke from the percolator, Artie said calmly, crouching beside them. He peeked over the windowsill. They're fanning out. They're going to clear this shack to secure their perimeter. Another volley of automatic gunfire tore through the front wall of the shack. Splinters of plywood exploded inward. We need to return fire, Declan shouted over the deafening roar of the rain and bullets. Brody, call it in. Use the SATCOM app on your phone. I'm trying, Brody yelled, his fingers flying across his screen. Storm is destroying the signal. I'm getting 0 bars. Artie, what do we have? Declan asked, crawling toward the old man. Artie gestured to the corner. You have the M40 with exactly 3 rounds of 308 left. And we have the Air Force Texan with half a tin of 25 caliber slugs. Declan stared at the antique sniper rifle and the heavily modified pellet gun. He was a Tier 1 military marksman, and he was trapped in a tin can facing a cartel hit squad with 3 bullets and an air rifle. The irony would have been funny if he wasn't about to die. Look, Artie pointed through the window. One of the sicarios had separated from the main group. He was sprinting up the jagged limestone bluff overlooking the parking lot, moving with terrifying speed. He dropped into a prone position behind a cluster of mesquite bushes, directly overlooking the shack. Through the driving rain, Declan saw the distinct, elongated profile of an SVD Dragunov sniper rifle. Overwatch. Declan evaluated instantly. He's got us pinned. If we try to run out the back, he'll cut us in half. If the assaulters push the front door, we can't pop up to shoot them because he'll take our heads off. Crack. Zing. A 7.62 2x54R round smashed through the window frame, missing Artie's head by inches and burying itself in the dirt wall behind them. The cartel sniper was zeroing in. He's a pro. Brody swallowed hard. He's compensating for the wind. I have to take him out, Declan said, reaching for the M40. If I drop the overwatch, we can use the remaining 2 rounds to disable the lead SUV's engine block, bottleneck them on the mud road, and make a break for the ravine. No. Artie stopped him, his hand clamping onto Declan's wrist with surprising strength. If you fire the M40, the muzzle blast will alert the entire assault team. They don't know exactly where we are in the shack right now. A loud shot gives them an exact vector. They will light this place up with everything they have. Then what the hell do we do? Declan demanded. Artie reached back and pulled the Air Force Texan PCP rifle from its padded sleeve. He checked the pressure gauge on the air cylinder. It's fully charged, Artie said, offering the heavy, scarred rifle to Declan. It has a built-in sound moderator. The storm will completely mask the acoustic signature of the shot. They won't hear it. They won't see a muzzle flash. Declan looked at the pellet gun. Artie. That guy is 300 yards away, elevated, in the middle of a Category 1 haboob and torrential rain. The kinetic energy of a pellet at that range. It's a 7.2, grain lead slug moving at 900 feet per second. Artie corrected, his eyes locking onto Declan's with absolute, unwavering intensity. At 300 yards, if you put it through his ocular cavity, it will enter his brain. But you can't fight the storm to get it there. Declan felt a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. This was the exact test. This was the A Shao Valley, 50 years later. He took the air rifle. The walnut stock felt heavy, solid. It felt like history. Brody, Declan said, his voice dropping into the cold, clinical calm of a professional. I need a wind call. Brody stared at him. Dec, I don't have the Kestrel. I can't. I didn't ask for a Kestrel, Declan interrupted softly. Be my Billy. Look at the rain. Tell me what the river is doing. Brody took a deep breath, fighting down his panic. He belly-crawled to the edge of the shattered window, keeping his head well below the sill. He didn't have his spotting scope. He just had his naked eyes and the raging Texas tempest. Target is at 2 o'clock. Elevation. Maybe 80 feet above our position, Brody said, his voice trembling before he forced it to steady. He looked out at the canyon, forcing himself to see it not as an obstacle, but as a living system. The rain is driving horizontally from the west, Brody observed. But right at the base of his cliff, it's swirling. There's a back eddy. The wind hits the limestone, compresses, and rolls backward. Declan racked the heavy bolt of the Texan, seeding a massive lead slug into the breach. He crept to the window, kneeling behind the splintered plywood. He raised the rifle, peering through the simple, heavy post iron sights. No magnification, no crosshairs, just a piece of metal aligning with a target 3 football fields away. The Dragunov fired again. The round slammed into the Coleman stove, exploding it in a shower of white gas and shrapnel. "He's getting frustrated," Artie said from the floor. "He's firing fast. He's not waiting for the wind to settle. That's his weakness." "Brody, talk to me," Declan whispered, his breathing slowing. The chaos of the gunfight faded. The screaming wind became background noise. He entered the bubble. "The wind is blowing left to right at 25 miles per hour, Brody said, his eyes darting across the landscape. "But, Dec, look at the mesquite tree halfway up the cliff. The branches are bending backward." Declan saw it. "The back eddy." "Right," Brody said, excitement bleeding into his fear. "The slug will drift right for the first 200 yards, but when it hits the cliff face, that back eddy is going to catch it and violently throw it back to the left." Declan's mathematical brain tried to calculate the opposing vectors, but he violently shoved the numbers away. "Don't calculate the steel. Feel the river." He aimed the air rifle high and drastically to the left, pointing the barrel almost at the open, gray sky beside the cliff. "Too much," Artie whispered behind him. "The rain is heavy. It's going to push the slug down faster than gravity alone. You have to ride the wave." Declan adjusted. He aimed high and right, directly into the teeth of the crosswind, trusting that the wind would push it, and the back eddy would catch it like a baseball glove. "When?" Declan asked softly. Brody watched the rain. He watched the way the sheets of water moved across the canyon in distinct, visible waves. "Pressure is building," Brody narrated. "Wait, wait. The wave is breaking. Dead air in 3, 2, 1. Send it." Declan exhaled, finding the natural pause in his heartbeat, and squeezed the trigger. Thwump. A microscopic hiss of compressed air was instantly swallowed by the thunder. Declan kept his eye perfectly aligned with the iron sights, experiencing the agonizing, multi-second flight time of a subsonic round. He couldn't see the slug. He could only trust the earth. 300 yards away, the cartel sniper was chambering another 7.62 round, his eye pressed tightly against his PSO-1 optic. He was preparing to fire a devastating volley into the shack. Suddenly, the glass of his optic exploded in a brilliant shower of red and silver. The 7.2 grain lead slug, having ridden the massive crosswind, dropped precisely into the swirling back eddy. The invisible air current caught the heavy pellet, stabilized its descent, and slammed it perfectly through the optical lens of the Dragunov, traveling straight into the sniper's right eye. The Sicario didn't even make a sound. His body went entirely limp, slumping backward off the limestone ledge and tumbling down into the muddy brush below. "Splash," Brody whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "He's down. December, you hit him." Declan didn't celebrate. He instantly dropped the Texan, grabbed the old M40, and racked the bolt. "The assaulters don't know they've lost their overwatch," Declan barked. "Brody, give me the vehicles." Brody shifted his gaze. Lead SUV is spinning its tires in the mud. The assaulters are using it for cover. Declan aimed the M40 through the window. He didn't need to read the wind for this. He had a 175 grain armor-piercing round, and a target only 100 yards away. He aimed straight through the grille of the black Suburban, right where the engine block sat. Boom! The deafening roar of the 308 shattered the tactical silence. The round punched through the grille, shattering the radiator and cracking the engine block. A massive plume of white steam erupted into the rain. Declan racked the bolt with lightning speed and fired his final round into the front right tire of the trailing SUV, blowing it out completely. "Vehicles disabled," Declan shouted. The cartel hit squad panicked. Their sniper wasn't covering them. Their lead vehicle was dead. Their escape route was blocked, and they were suddenly taking highly accurate, heavy-caliber sniper fire from an enemy they couldn't see. Believing they had stumbled into a heavily fortified trap, the Sicarios broke. They abandoned the vehicles, scrambling wildly into the dense, thorny brush of the Badlands, disappearing into the blinding dust storm. Silence, save for the relentless rain, finally fell over the Black Brush Range. Declan slowly lowered the M40. He leaned back against the wall of the shack, sliding down until he hit the dirt floor. He was shaking violently, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a freight train. Brody slumped against the wall beside him. Letting out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 10 minutes. He looked at his phone. "Bars are back," Brody gasped. "The storm is breaking. I'm calling Border Patrol, BORTAC." Artie didn't sit down. He calmly walked over to the shattered window, picked up the Air Force Texan, and gently wiped the rainwater off the walnut stalk with his sleeve. He looked down at Declan, who was staring at his own hands, struggling to process the impossible shot he had just made under the most intense pressure of his life. "You feel it now, don't you?" Artie asked quietly. Declan looked up. The arrogance, the digital certainty, the belief that he could conquer nature with an algorithm, it was all gone. It had been burned away in the crucible of the devil's throat. "I felt it," Declan whispered. "I stopped fighting it." Artie smiled. It was a true, deep smile that reached all the way to his tired, pale eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his worn, leather-bound notebook, the map of the Aishau Winds. He tossed it onto Declan's lap. "Keep it," Artie said. "Add your own pages." 2 hours later, the parking lot was swarming with flashing red and blue lights. Federal agents, Texas Rangers, and armored CBP vehicles surrounded the abandoned cartel SUVs. They found the heavy contraband locked in the trunks, and they found the body of the Sicario sniper at the base of the bluff. A grizzled ranger captain stood near the shack, shaking his head as he looked at the shattered Dragunov scope. "Hell of a shot, Corporal," the ranger said to Declan, who was giving his statement. "Especially with a pellet gun. Must have been a lucky gust of wind." Declan stood tall. He looked over at Artie, who was quietly packing his push broom into the bed of his rusted Ford F-150, ignored by the flurry of federal agents. "It wasn't luck, Captain," Declan said, his voice calm and anchored. "You just have to know how to listen to the canyon." As the sun began to peek through the breaking storm clouds, casting long, golden shadows across the limestone bluffs, Declan walked over to his truck. He unlocked the Pelican case and looked at his $15,000 Lapua Magnum. It was a beautiful, lethal machine. He respected it. He would use it. But as he closed the case, he knew the truth. The machine was just a piece of metal. The true weapon was the man who knew how to find the silence between the wind. The dust at Black Brush Range has settled, but the legend of Arthur Callahan and Corporal Declan Knox will echo through those limestone canyons forever. Declan arrived as a cocky prodigy, wholly reliant on microchips and algorithms. But he left as a true marksman, forged in the chaotic winds of a cartel gunfight and guided by the ghosts of Mac V. Sog. Artie proved that all the money and technology in the world can never replace the lethal instincts of a man who knows how to truly listen to the earth. That impossible air rifle shot wasn't just a victory over the elements. It was a passing of the torch from one generation of warrior to the next. If you were blown away by this incredible clash of modern technology and old-school grit, hit that like button, share this video with a fellow shooter, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable stories from the firing line.